Good evening. I'm Paul Roth. I am chairperson of the Events Committee, which coordinates the lecture series that you're here for. You're in for a treat this evening, 2 lectures that relate to different time periods, really, of hymnody. The first one will be relating to the early Brethren hymnals and the influence of English upon those hymnals. The second one will be a review of our participation, actually, in the new Mennonite hymnal. We trust that everyone has picked up a little packet from the lectern out in the narthex. You'll need that for this first lecture. Just a bit of announcements for you. It is a requirement of the church for people to wear masks, except when you're speaking, like we are here. And we've arranged for the seating to be in alternate rows as the congregation has in their morning worship. Thank you for coming. There are offering plates in the exits coming out of the sanctuary that we invite your sharing your resources to help support the Brethren Mennonite Heritage Center. We also will let you know that between the lectures, around 5:30, there will be refreshments out on the portico here in the main entrance where you came in. These are being provided by hospitality committee with the Bridgewater Church of the Brethren. I'm going to monitor that a bit. We're going to try to do that in 20 minutes. That's grab and gobble, I think, is what it's going to be. But we want to come back in here for the second lecture to be on time so we don't delay that very much. So I'll be helping to coordinate that. Let me give an introduction for our first speaker. Excuse me. This is Sam Funkhouser, who is the new executive director for the Brethren Mennonite Heritage Center. He's a member of the Old German Baptist Brethren Church New Conference. You can, if you've not met him, you will discern his appearance related to the simple living, but also ordered living. And he's going to talk some about that in terms of the hymnals that they've used. He's been a regular writer and presenter on Brethren history and theology, and his forthcoming book on early Brethren hymnody serves as a basis for this lecture. He is, I think that's out now, is that correct, Sam? So that would be of some interest, I think, for you. Let me just offer a prayer before Sam leads. Inspiration of our soul's desire. You give us the tunes, the melodies of your grace and love, and we gladly sing your praise, O God. Bless these 2 speakers this evening as we open our spirits to their research and their work to make music a part of a congregational life and praise. We say this in the name of Jesus, the troubadour of your love. Amen.
Our first talk this evening is going to cover the first 5 English language hymnals and hymn books used by the Brethren. We've entitled this talk this evening, In the Line of Duty, because as you'll see, the first of these 5 books was entitled The Christian's Duty. Now, this is more than just a bad attempt at a pun. As you'll see as we go on this evening, The Christian's Duty really established a hymn canon and set the pattern for the books that came after it. But before we get into our talk itself this evening, I'd like to share a little bit about how I got interested in this project and why I think the study of old hymnals and hymn books is both fascinating and important. My interest in this project goes back to the summer of 2011. At that point in time, I was in seminary and I was completing a summer internship at a Church of the Brethren congregation, just down the road here actually, at Antioch in Woodstock. And one day that summer, I was sitting in the pastor's office, and I pulled a couple old hymnals off the shelf and started looking through them. In particular, I flipped through the 1901 and the 1925 Church of the Brethren hymnals. And just in that afternoon that summer, I noticed some really interesting things about these books. First of all, with the 1901 hymnal, this one seemed to be a very distinctively Brethren book. I mean, after all, look at it. It's black, right? But as you even just flip through this book, you see a lot of very characteristically Brethren things. For example, if you look at the table of contents, you see hymns on the ordinances, not just baptism and communion, but also the Lord's Supper and feet washing. So you see all three parts of the Brethren Love Feast in this hymnal. Likewise, there's a section of anti-war hymns in this hymnal, non-resistance hymns. So it seems to be very characteristically Brethren. But when I started looking through this 1925 hymnal, I got a very different feeling. I mean, right off the bat, it's blue. Oh my. But when you flip through this hymnal and look at its table of contents, there's nothing in this book that would be distinctively Brethren or even Anabaptist. There are no feet washing hymns in this book. And what's more, there's a section of patriotic hymns in this 1925 Church of Brethren hymnal. And I thought, wow, what a difference between these two books. Now, I knew that the first couple decades of the 20th century were very important ones for the Church of the Brethren. A lot changed during this time period, and these books really reflect those changes quite well. And so that got me wondering, were there similar shifts that happened in the hymnals that came before these, or the hymnals that came after? So I sort of tucked that in the back of my mind, and then when I got back to school in the fall, I did a little bit of digging. I did a little bit of research into what sort of studies had been done in Brethren Hymnody. And what I found is that over the years, there's been a lot of really good work done on the German hymnody of the Brethren. In fact, if you're interested in German hymn books, absolutely the best book I can recommend is the German Hymnody of the Brethren by Hedwig Dernball, published by the Brethren Encyclopedia. It's a great book, covers all 9 of the German language Brethren hymn books. But what I also found is that no one had really done a similar study with the English language books of the Brethren. So I thought, hey, that would be a really interesting project. And in my naivety, I thought, hey, maybe I could do that as a master's thesis project. And so I set out to work on the project in the spring of 2012. That was my last semester in seminary. My initial ambitious goal was to research and write on all 10 major English language Brethren hymnals. There have been, if you look at all the different Brethren denominations, there have been 10 of these books over the years. I quickly found that that would be well beyond the scope of your typical master's thesis, so I pared it down to 5, the 5 books that we're going to be talking about this evening. Now, these books make a really good historical sample because they go from the first book in the late 1700s through the time of the division of the 1880s. There's 2 books that came about as a result of that division. So it's a really good historical sample. But even paring it down to these 5 books, the project blossomed well beyond most master's theses. In fact, by the time I finished my first chapter on the Christian's duty, it was about the length of your typical master's paper. By the time I was done, it was about 350 pages in the summer of 2012. It's like a book, basically. And as Paul says, it actually is a book now. Just this summer, it's been published by the Brethren Encyclopedia as a companion volume to Hedda Dernball's book. So all that is to say that there's a lot of details that undergird what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. And unfortunately, we don't have nearly enough time to share them all with you. So I'm just going to be hitting the high points, sort of skimming the surface. But I hope at the very least we can stimulate your interest in some of these old books as well. I also want to just mention briefly why I think the study of hymnody is so important. If we want to do historical theology, if we want to talk about history of doctrine with a group like the Brethren, unfortunately, we don't have works of systematic theology that we can turn to. Brethren historically were not theologians. They didn't sit down and write long, extended doctrinal works like you find in most other Christian traditions. So certainly the best source that we have for doing historical theology among the Brethren would be annual conference minutes, the yearly pronouncements of the church on different topics. But I would contend that the second best source we have for looking at how the beliefs of a church like the Brethren have changed over the years is through hymnals. Because if you think about it, with each generation, the church tended to produce a new hymnal, and the hymnal tended to reflect what the church believed at the time. But more than this, not only did a hymnal reflect the church, what the church believed, they also shaped the church. Because when a new hymnal comes out, you have these new hymns, And as the church starts to sing them Sunday after Sunday, year after year, they start to shape the beliefs of the church as well. So hymnals both reflect the church, where the church was, and they shape the thought life of the church. They're like the sung theology of the church. So they're a really good source for doing historical theology. And that's the approach that we're going to take as we talk this afternoon. Okay? So with all that being said, let's get started. As we mentioned earlier, the first English language hymn book printed and used by the Brethren was entitled The Christian's Duty. It appeared in 1791. It was published in Germantown, Pennsylvania by Peter Liebert. Now, Liebert was a minister in the Germantown congregation. He had also been an apprentice of Christopher Sauer prior to the Revolutionary War. Of course, the Sauer press was destroyed during the war. Most of the equipment was confiscated. Liebert was able to buy back some of Sauer's equipment and continue printing after the war. So you can think of Liebert's press as kind of like a continuation of the Sauer press. Interestingly enough, Liebert was also a brother-in-law to Alexander Mack Jr. Their wives were sisters. So just a little bit of information about him. The Christian's Duty, when it first appeared, had 352 hymns, and like most hymnals of its day in America, it did not have any music. It just had the texts of the hymns. And unlike the hymnals that we're used to today, the hymns in this book are not organized by subject or topic. Instead, they appear alphabetically by first line. I want to show you, this is what the book looks like on the inside. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is a page from the Christian's Duty. The page on the left is from the 1791 first edition. The page on the right is from the 5th edition and final edition in 1825. It's the same page. All 5 editions had the same 352 hymns to start with and the same words, but you notice some differences in formatting. The first edition of this book, all of the nouns were capitalized, kind of like they would be in German. You see the use of the medial S, like in this last line, kindred in Christ. The S in Christ looks like a lowercase f without the line through it. That was typical in early American printing. It uses Roman numerals. There's no meter designations. By the time we get to the final edition, all of these things had changed. But again, I just wanted to show you this to you to give you sort of a feeling of what this book looked like to its user in 1791. Thankfully, Liebert, in the preface to the book, tells us why the Brethren felt the need to print this book in 1791. So here's what he says. And this comes directly from the preface. The reason for printing this hymn book is because of the inconvenience arising from having several sorts of hymn books and meeting at once. It was therefore thought prudent to remove this inconvenience by collecting the most approved hymns of the several books and reducing them into one small octavo with a complete index, which is wanting in the hymn book which we have latterly used, although it was otherwise truly excellent. Yes, that is all one sentence. But there's a number of interesting things we can glean from what Liebert says here. Apparently, not only did the Brethren print an English hymn book in 1791, but they had been using English hymn books in their worship for some time prior to 1791. In fact, to the point that they had a favorite book that they had sort of gravitated to. And so that brings a couple questions to mind. The first question this brings to mind is, why were the Brethren singing in English so early in their history? This is a particularly interesting question when we consider the case of the Mennonites, who were the Brethren's closest cultural and theological neighbors in America, and who did not print their first English hymn book until 1847, over 50 years later. So why was this? I think there's 2 possible explanations for this. The first is that the Brethren were able to settle down here more quickly than the Mennonites. With the Mennonites started coming to the New World in the late 1600s, and they continued coming throughout the 1700s, even into the mid-1800s. And with each wave of immigration, that helped to sort of re-solidify the cultural and linguistic ties that Mennonites had to the Old World. The Brethren were different. The Brethren first came here, the first group came in 1719. Almost all of them came through the 1720s, and by 1740, there weren't really any Brethren left in Europe. So they were able to settle down here in one wave more quickly. Another reason, perhaps, that the Brethren started singing English sooner than the Mennonites did is that during this period, the Brethren tended to be more evangelistic. They tended to be more outgoing. To use their own words, they thought they had more zeal than the Mennonites. That's the word that they used. But because of this, because the brethren had more of a evangelistic outlook, it would make sense for them to start singing in English sooner so that they could convert more of their English-speaking neighbors. So those are the two reasons, I think, that the brethren probably started singing, or that the brethren started singing in English sooner than the Mennonites did. Another question that comes to mind as we look at Leibert's comments here is, what were these books, these English language hymn books that the brethren were using prior to 1791? And in particular, what was this one book that had become their favorite? Well, thankfully, there's no better place to try to answer that question than the school where I was completing my seminary studies. So I did my seminary work at Princeton in New Jersey. In the library in Princeton, in the special collections, there's a collection devoted specifically to early American hymnody. In fact, it's probably the most complete collection of its kind anywhere in the world. And so being a student there, I was able to spend several weeks in the special collections and look at literally every hymn book that would have been available to the brethren in Germantown in the early 1790s. So I went through all of these books, cataloged their contents, and compared them to the contents of the Christian's Duty. For those of you who are familiar with biblical studies, it was kind of like an exercise in source criticism. So I did some source criticism on the Christian's Duty. And through that process, I was able to figure out specifically which books Leibert used to compile the Christian's Duty. And when we look at these books, we notice a number of really, really fascinating things. So the first thing that became evident very quickly was what that one book was that the brethren had been using that was their favorite prior to the Christian's Duty. This book was actually two books. So there were two hymn books that were entitled A Choice Collection of Hymns. One was printed in 1782, and one was printed in 1784. These two books don't have any hymns in common, so they're kind of like a choice collection of hymns, Volume 1 and Volume 2. These two books contribute about 60% of the hymns in the Christian's Duty. So the majority of the hymns in the Christian's Duty come from these two books. Now, these two hymn books, which apparently were the brethren's favorite, had been published by L. Hannon Winchester. Winchester was the leader of the Universal Baptists in Philadelphia. So the Universal Baptists were Baptists who believed in the universal restoration. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with this doctrine, the universal restoration was also something that the majority of the early brethren believed in as well. The universal restoration is not universalism. Restorationists believed that there was a hell, that there would be people in it, that it was really terrible and you didn't want to go there. However, somehow or another, the grace of God would overcome even death and hell, and all people would eventually be saved. This is what the early brethren believed. This is also what the Universal Baptists believed. In fact, it's possible that their leader, Winchester, who published these books, came to believe in this doctrine through brethren influence. There was a book on the restoration that was translated by a brethren person, published by Christopher Sauer, that Winchester pointed to as one of the reasons that he became a restorationist. We also know that there was a strong connection between Winchester and the Germantown Brethren. Winchester actually preached in the Germantown Brethren congregation in the 1780s. And so by using these hymn books, it suggests to us that perhaps the brethren considered these Universal Baptists to be their closest English-speaking theological neighbors in America. Now, these two Winchester books, for the most part, just had standard hymns that most other Baptists at the time were singing. So we're talking about hymns by Isaac Watts, by the Wesleys, by Newton and Cowper, sort of the standard evangelical English hymn writers. But there were some unique things about the collection. One thing that was unique about Winchester's books is that he changed the wording in a lot of these standard hymns. This was pretty common. Most hymn book compilers in this day would alter hymns. The idea of copyright, as we think about it today, was not part of the culture during this day. And so most people who made hymn books would freely change wording here and there in hymns, and Winchester did that. Leibert, on the other hand, really did not change the wording of hymns. So because of that, the more unique wording of these standard hymns that Winchester had made ended up in the Christian's Duty. There are also a few hymns in these Winchester books that are unique to the collection. We don't know exactly who wrote them. They could have been written by Winchester. The book doesn't say for sure. But of all these unique hymns in the Winchester books, one of them is actually on the Universal Restoration. You can find that hymn on page 3 of your handout. It's the hymn on the left, which is number 77 in the Christian's Duty. The first line is, Father of faithful Abram, hear. This hymn is a theological reflection on Romans 11, where Paul talks about how all Israel will be saved, and because of this, the Gentiles will be saved as well. So this hymn reflects on that idea and projects hope that perhaps through the salvation of Israel, all humankind will be saved too. So that hymn did make its way into the Christian's Duty. Now, with that said, even though it was clear that the Winchester books were the Brethren's favorite books prior to 1791, Liebert took hymns from these books in a critical way. And I'll give you 2 examples. There were a number of baptism hymns in the Winchester books, and most of them are in the Christian's Duty. I mean, after all, both groups practice believer's baptism, both groups practice immersion baptism. But the one baptism hymn that is not in the Christian's Duty from the Winchester books is a hymn that explicitly references baptizing someone backwards, once, in the name of Jesus. Okay, so that hymn is not in the Christian's Duty. Another thing about these Winchester books, the first one begins and the second one ends with a patriotic hymn. Neither of these hymns are in the Christian's Duty either. So at least when it comes to the mode of baptism and when it comes to patriotism and the 2 kingdoms, there were some clear differences between these 2 groups. And we see that in how Liebert selectively used hymns from the Winchester books. Okay, so about 60% of the Christian's Duty comes from these Universal Baptist hymn books. The remaining 40% come from a number of different places. Again, mostly standard hymn books that other Baptists in America would have been using at the time. I'll highlight just a few things about the remaining 40% of the hymns in the book. First thing I'll point out is that the second largest source for hymns in the Christian's Duty was called a selection of hymns by John Ripon. So this second largest source contributed 29 hymns to the collection, so much fewer hymns in the Winchester books. The fact that Liebert used Ripon's selection in itself is not really that big of a deal. Ripon's selection was a pretty popular hymn book in America at the time. But what's interesting about Ripon's selection is that it was first published in 1787 in England. An American printing of the book didn't come about until later in the 1790s. So by the time you account for shipping this book, literally shipping it from England to America, this would have been a very, very new book when Liebert used it for hymns in the Christian's Duty. And what this suggests to us is that the brethren in Germantown at the time were both aware of the latest, newest church music of their day and open to using that music in the Christian's Duty. So to put a term on this that we throw around today, the brethren in the 1790s were into contemporary Christian music. It's in the Christian's Duty. Very, very new hymns in this book. Another thing we notice about the remainder of the hymns in the book, when we look at where they come from, is that, again, like with the Winchester books, Liebert did not really change the wording of hymns. He took hymns almost exactly as they appear in their source volume and put it in the Christian's Duty. And because of this, that was actually one of the reasons I was able to figure out which books he used, because he uses the wording exactly from a particular book. However, there are 2 exceptions to this. There are 2 hymns that have significantly different wording in the Christian's Duty than they do in their source volume. And you can find these 2 hymns on page 1 of your handout. So on page 1, you've got these 2 hymns. On the left, you can see how they appeared in their source book, and on the right, how they appear in the Christian's Duty. These 2 hymns come from a book that was known as the Newport Collection, which was the first Baptist hymnal published in America in 1766. Both of these hymns are baptismal hymns. And as you look at these hymns, there are a number of differences in wording between how they appear in the Christian's Duty and how they appear in the book that they came from. These differences in wording almost seem like they were transmitted orally. It's like playing the game of telephone. You know what I'm talking about? Where you whisper a message to someone, they whisper it to the next person, it goes around the room, and by the time you get to where you started, it's a different message, right? That's what the changes in these hymns seem to suggest, that these hymns were sung from memory. The best explanation for this that I have is that perhaps the brethren started singing in English at their baptism services, and these may have been two of the first English hymns that they used. If you think about it, brethren baptism ceremonies were always held outdoors. They were held in flowing water. It was a public event where anybody in the neighborhood could see what was going on. And again, for a group that was really intentional about trying to convert their neighbors, it would make sense to sing hymns in English at these baptism ceremonies. So it's possible that early on, that the song leader, perhaps a deacon, memorized these hymns and lined them out from memory at a baptism service. And then as time went by and these hymns were sung from memory, the changes that we see in the Christian's duty crept in. So again, that's the best explanation that I have. But if that is the case, again, that would suggest that the brethren started singing in English at their baptism ceremonies, and these might have been two of the first hymns that they sang. Another thing we notice about the remainder of the hymns in the Christian's duty is that Liebert did not really make any effort to translate German hymns into English. So none of the more distinctive pietist or brethren-authored German hymns were translated for the Christian's duty. And if you think about it, Liebert probably didn't feel any need to. German was still their primary language. They sang German hymns every Sunday, and he probably didn't see why they would need to be translated. They were still singing these hymns. Unfortunately, this pattern was continued in all of the hymn books that followed the Christian's duty. There really wasn't an effort made to translate German hymns into English. And so by the time the brethren stopped singing in English, those hymns were largely forgotten. And that pattern was started here in the Christian's duty. A final thing we notice about the remainder of the hymns in the book is that there are very few hymns that were actually written by brethren. By the time you count for all the hymns in the book that come from other sources, there are only 5 hymns that appear in this book for the first time. You can find these 5 hymns on page 2 of your handout. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time this afternoon to examine these hymns in depth. I would encourage you on your own time, though, to read through these hymns and reflect on them. They offer a really fascinating glimpse into the thought life of the brethren in the late 1700s. I'll also point out that one of these hymns, the hymn on the right, number 326, is a feet-washing hymn. So when Liebert looked at all these hymnals that other English-speaking people in America were using, he didn't find any feet-washing hymns. So there was a feet-washing hymn that was written for the book so that they would have a hymn in English that they could use at their communion services. So again, that gives you a little bit of an idea of what went into the Christian's duty and some of the things that we can learn about the brethren by looking at the sources that Liebert used and how he used them. Now, after the book was first printed in 1791, it was printed 4 more times, in 1801, 1813, 1825 in Germantown, and then there was one edition that was published in 1822 in Ohio, which shows the sort of geographic spread that was happening in the church at the time. With each edition, there were hymns that were added to the book. These were added as appendices in the back of the book. And by the time you get to the final 3 printings, the hymn book had grown to 504 hymns in total. Now, the hymns that were added in the later editions were largely taken from the same sorts of sources that Liebert used for the first edition of the book, just sort of standard American hymnody. But there are a few things I'll highlight about the hymns that were added later to the book. The first thing I'll point out is that another hymn that was added to this book, starting in the 2nd edition, was another hymn on the universal restoration. So if you look on page 3 of your handout again, the hymn on the right appeared again, starting with the 2nd edition of the book. And this hymn we actually know was written by Winchester himself, because it comes from a later book that Winchester published. And it's even more explicitly about the doctrine than the hymn that was in the 1st edition of the book. So again, this hymn sort of shows that continuing importance of the universal restoration for the brethren, even going into the 19th century, and the connection that they had with Winchester himself. A second interesting thing about the hymns that were added later to the book is that there are 4 hymns with choruses in the later editions of the Christian's duty. Now, hymns with choruses were a very new thing in American church music at this time. They were associated with camp meeting revivalism. And the fact that there are 4 of these hymns in the Christian's duty is kind of surprising, given the stance that brethren would take against revivalism in just a decade or two. But at least in the earliest part of the 19th century, apparently they had some openness to revivalistic music. And a final thing I'll point out about the hymns that were added later is that there was one more Brethren-authored hymn added to the book. You can find it on page 4 of your handout. And it's another feet-washing hymn. It's the hymn up on the left corner, the supplement number 34. So starting with the second edition of the Christian's Duty, there were 2 Brethren feet-washing hymns in the book. Now, ultimately, we don't know how widely the Christian's Duty was used. It was printed 5 times, and one of those printings was in Ohio, in the West. But to give you some perspective, during the time period that the first 3 editions of the Christian's Duty were published, the German hymn book of the Brethren, the Psalterspiel, was printed 7 times. So very clearly, German is still the primary language of the Brethren during this period. And ultimately, the greatest influence the Christian's Duty had was not during its day, but it was the effect that it had on the books that followed it. And so with that said, we'll continue on with our next book. So the second major English language hymn book used by the Brethren was entitled A Choice Selection of Hymns. This book was first published in 1830 in Canton, Ohio, and unfortunately, we do not know who put this book together. The book does not reference an editor or a committee, so it was just compiled by some anonymous brethren working together in Ohio. As the title suggests, this book is a lot smaller than the Christian's Duty. So here's a choice selection of hymns, and here's the Christian's Duty. This new book had 223 hymns, so it was about half the size of the Christian's Duty. And as you flip through this book, you very quickly notice that it's essentially an abridged version of the Christian's Duty. So 91% of the hymns in this book were taken from the Christian's Duty without any alteration. It's essentially a pocket-sized version of the Christian's Duty. So let me show you what this book looks like. This is a 2-page spread from inside this book. So if you open it up, these are some hymns you might see. Now you notice there are 3 hymns on these pages, but you also notice, see these numbers at the top in brackets? Those are references to where you can find these hymns in the Christian's Duty. So hymn 216 in this new book was 305 in the Christian's Duty. Hymn 217 was from the appendix, number 115, and hymn 218 is 311 in the Christian's Duty. So this book was very clearly intended to be used in worship alongside the Christian's Duty, at least initially. Now, the simple fact that by the time we get to 1830, the Brethren decided for their new hymn book to just make an abridged version of the Christian's Duty, I think says a lot about the mindset of the Brethren in this period. We saw that Liebert and the Germantown Brethren in the 1790s were aware of what other Christians were singing. They were aware of the newest music of the day, and they included that music in their book. By the time we get to 1830, that's not the case. The Brethren aren't really paying attention to what others are singing anymore, and instead looking within their church to their own tradition to find hymns for their new book. And this isn't entirely surprising. It was during this period that the Brethren had decisions at annual meeting against accepting new members who had been baptized by other churches. They had decisions against allowing people to partake of the Lord's Supper at communion who weren't members. They had decisions against allowing ministers from other churches to preach in their congregations. So it was definitely a period that there was a hardening off of the boundaries between the Brethren and other churches, and we see that reflected in this little book. So because this book is basically hymns from the Christian's Duty, that source-critical approach that we took with the Christian's Duty doesn't really apply here. But we can see a few things from which hymns were kept in this book and which ones were left out. For the most part, the folks who compiled the second hymn book got about half of each kind of hymn. So they got about half the baptism hymns, half the Christmas hymns, half the Easter hymns, and so on and so forth. But there's some things that we can notice. So for example, talking about the baptism hymns, there were 9 baptism hymns in the Christian's Duty, and 4 of them are in the new book, so about half of them. Of those 4 hymns, though, 2 of them are these 2 hymns that we talked about earlier with the changes in the wording. So I think that adds weight to the theory that these 2 hymns were really significant for the Brethren in their early years. We also notice that there were 2 universal restoration hymns in the later editions of the Christian's Duty. One of them is in the new book, and the one that's in the book is the later hymn by Winchester that's even more explicitly about the doctrine. So it just shows the continuing importance of this doctrine for the Brethren even into the 1830s. Now, one category of hymns that was left out in the new book were hymns with choruses. So those 4 hymns with choruses in the later edition of the Christian's Duty are not in this new book in 1830. And that's not surprising, because by this point, the brethren had made decisions at annual meeting against revival meetings, against altar calls, and against revivalistic music. And so we see that reflected in the omission of those 4 hymns with choruses. Another interesting omission in this second hymn book is one of the 2 feet washing hymns. So we said in the first edition of the Christian's Duty, there was this really long feet washing hymn that appeared. This hymn is not in the new book. And there's probably a really good reason why. You see, this hymn, this feet washing hymn in the first edition of the Christian's Duty, was adopted by the Moravians. After the Christian's Duty was published in 1791, the Moravians included this feet washing hymn in their hymn book. And it is hard to overstate just how poorly the brethren got along with the Moravians at this point in time. And so it's likely that because the Moravians started using this feet washing hymn, the brethren stopped using it. And that's kind of sad to me, because it's a really beautiful hymn, but it never appeared in another brethren hymn book again. It was forgotten. Another thing we see about this new book, that's a continuation of the pattern from the Christian's Duty, there's no attempt to include German hymn translations, and there are very few brethren-authored hymns. So there are only 2 hymns in this new book that may have been written by brethren. You can find them on page 4 of your handout. One of them, hymn number 99, is a hymn on unity in the church. Unity was becoming a very important theme among the brethren in this time as they were growing both numerically and geographically. And so we have a hymn on that subject in this book. And the other hymn, interestingly enough, especially in the later stanzas of the hymn, has tinges of revivalistic thinking. So we said the brethren took a very strong stance against revivalistic practices, but nevertheless, they started to be influenced by revivalistic thinking, by this urgency of a need to accept Christ and be saved today and not put off that choice. You see that in this hymn, and we'll start to see more of it in the books that follow. And there's a little bit of a tension here between this revivalistic thinking and the earlier restorationist thinking. By the time we get to the next book, the revivalist thinking is going to win out. So this book, A Choice Selection of Hymns, even though it's a small book, its size shouldn't be taken as an indication of its importance. In fact, that you could make an argument that this was the most significant hymn book that the brethren used in the 19th century for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was printed and used for a longer period of time than any of the other books we're talking about this afternoon. It was started in 1830, and it was printed through the 1870s, so it had a long term of service. A second reason this book is important is because it became the lens through which later hymn book compilers viewed the Christian's Duty. In other words, if a hymn from the Christian's Duty is not in this book, it was largely forgotten by later generations of brethren. And a third reason that this book is so significant is because this is the book that the brethren were singing from when they made the transition to English as their primary language. So it had a very strong formative effect on the church. This book was often bound in the same cover with the German book that the brethren used in this period. They were both small books. And so it sort of functioned as a bilingual hymn book. In the 1830s, you usually find these books with the German hymns in the front. In the 1840s, usually the English hymns are in the front. And then by the 1850s and 60s, when you find copies of this book, like this one, it doesn't have the German hymns at all. So by the 1850s or 60s, most brethren had transitioned to English as being their only language that they used in worship. And this was the book they were using when they did it. So this little book served the church well for a long time. But its small size was eventually seen as a handicap, particularly in churches that sang only in English. And so that brings us to the development of our third hymn book that we're going to talk about this afternoon. So starting in 1849, there was a query that came asking for a new book to be printed, one that would be larger. The answer at that point was no. Another query came in 1858 and then one in 1860. And by 1860, the annual meeting decided to take action. In 1860, the annual meeting appointed a committee of 5 brethren, and their job was to make a new hymn book, keeping as many hymns as possible from a choice selection, and adding new hymns to the book to make a larger collection. Well, shortly after this decision was made in 1860, war broke out. And the 5 brethren on this committee were all from different states, including here in Virginia. John Klein was on this hymn book committee. And because of the war, the committee wasn't really able to get together to work on this project. So instead of completing this new hymn book as a committee, they gave the job to one committee member by himself. And that committee member was James Quinter. Now, Quinter was an excellent choice for someone to make a hymn book. He was widely respected across the brotherhood. He had lived in both Pennsylvania and Ohio. He had worked as a teacher and a publisher. And he considered himself, in his own way of thinking, to be both conservative and progressive. And Quinter sort of embodied the mainstream of Brethren thought by the time we get to the 1860s. So Quinter thought of himself as conservative in that he was very committed to the traditional Brethren way of doing things. He was very committed to the ordinances, to non-resistance, to nonconformity, and so on. But he also considered himself to be progressive in that he was open to new ways of spreading the gospel, new ways of growing the church. Things like Sunday schools and revival meetings and higher education and foreign missions, things that were more controversial among the traditionalist wing of the church. And we see this sort of conservative and progressive tension in the book that Quinter produced. So it took Quinter a while to complete his project, and by 1867 it was done. So this third book, the full title of this book, is a collection of psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, but it was more commonly referred to by the title on the spine, which is simply the Brethren's Hymn Book. When this book appeared, it was very evident that Quinter had completed the job given to him very well. So in his new book, 240 of the 293 hymns from the old book are in this book. So he did keep a majority of the hymns from the old book. But he also added new hymns, a lot of new hymns. Quinter's book, when he brought it to print, had 818 hymns. So he added over 500 new hymns to this third Brethren hymn book. Now, in his preface, he gives a couple reasons for why the book has so many hymns. One reason he gives is that when he was working on the project, his own personal collection of hymnals grew to almost 100 volumes. So in other words, he consulted almost 100 hymnals in compiling this book, and so he found so many great hymns, he just wanted to put them in the book. A second reason he gives for why the book has so many hymns is because he saw it as useful for things other than just public worship. He acknowledges that if you want a hymn book to use in public worship, you don't need 818 hymns. But he pointed out that for many church members of this day, their entire library consisted of 2 books, their Bible and their hymn book. And so by including a number of additional hymns in the book, he saw the book as being useful for the average member's personal devotions, as a way of enriching and fulfilling their spiritual life. And so that's why he included so many hymns in the book. So as we start looking at this new book that Quinter put together, we notice a couple of things. First thing we notice right off the bat is that unlike the 2 previous books, the hymns in this book are organized by subject or topic, like most hymnals we're used to today. Certainly when Quinter looked at 100 hymnals in compiling this book, he noticed that arranging hymns alphabetically by first line was not the norm. So he brought the book more into the standard practice. Another thing that we can do is look at the hymns themselves. And I think we can look at hymns in 2 different ways. We can look at the hymns that Quinter kept from the old book and what he did with them. And then we can also look at the hymns that he included from new books and what they tell us about his thinking and the thinking of the brethren at the time. So we'll start with the hymns from the old book. One thing that Quinter did to the hymns that he kept from the old book, even though he did keep most of them, is that he shortened them from an average of 7 stanzas in the old book to an average of 5 stanzas in his book, probably to save space. And for the most part, when Quinter shortened these hymns, he was able to do so without significantly changing the meaning of the hymn. But there were some exceptions to this, and some rather noticeable ones, and I'll share one in particular with you. So both of the hymns on the universal restoration from the Christian's Duty are in Quinter's book, so back on page 3 of your handout. However, both of these hymns were shortened. And in particular, the hymn on the right, the one that's really explicitly about the doctrine, he removed 2 stanzas, stanzas 3 and stanzas 4. And by removing stanza 3 and 4 from this hymn, it's no longer a hymn about the universal restoration at all. This is not surprising. We know that Quinter did not like the Restorationist teaching, as did most brethren during this period. It had fallen out of favor. And so even though he kept these hymns from the old book, he modified them so they weren't about the universal restoration any longer. Besides shortening hymns, Quinter also changed the wording in some of the hymns that he kept from the old book. So we said that in the Winchester books that served as the basis for the Christian's duty, they had the standard hymns in that book had some unique wordings, and that carried on through the Christian's duty and a choice selection. Certainly Quinter, when he was looking at all these hymnals that other people were using, noticed these differences in wording for these standard hymns that the brethren had been using. And so he changed the wording of these standard hymns to the wording that other Christians were using in their worship, rather than the more unique ones that were in the Brethren hymn book. So he brought them into line with sort of mainstream American church practice. So that's some of the things we see with what he did with the old hymns. We can also see some interesting things with the hymns that Quinter added to this new book. And like we said, there were over 500 new hymns that Quinter added to his book. And these new hymns really reflect his conservative and his progressive tendencies. So on the one hand, Quinter was able to find a number of hymns at this point from looking at other hymnals that related to brethren distinctives. So not only are there hymns on baptism and communion and feet washing in Quinter's book, but there are also hymns on the Holy Kiss, and there are hymns on anointing. So there's far more ordinance-related hymns in Quinter's book than there were in the previous books. Likewise, Quinter was able to find 2 anti-war hymns that he included, and he even found from a Universalist writer of all people, a hymn with a very non-creedal slant. So being non-creedal was a very important part of the Brethren DNA, and he actually found a non-creedal hymn that he put in this book. So in some ways, the book is more distinctively Brethren than the books that came before it. But we also see some of Quinter's progressive tendencies. One thing we notice is that in Quinter's book, there are 13 hymns with choruses. Now, by this point, by the late 1860s, hymns with choruses were very commonplace in American church music, but they were still controversial among the brethren. So he could have included many more hymns with choruses than he did, but he included some, about 13 of them. There are also missionary hymns in Quinter's book, though again, he was cautious. See, Quinter was progressive, but unlike someone like Henry Holsinger, he was cautiously progressive. He wanted to very slowly bring the church along and shape the church, and he didn't want to rock the boat too much. So there are missionary hymns in Quinter's book, but they're not categorized as missionary hymns. There's no section of missionary hymns. Instead, he puts them under the section for the ministry, but they're still missionary hymns. One of them, for example, is from Greenland's Icy Mountains, which was by far the most widely sung missionary anthem of the 19th century. In addition to hymns with choruses and missionary hymns, there are 2 temperance hymns in Quinter's book, and a couple of hymns that were for the dedication of church buildings. Now, again, Quinter was not as progressive as he could have been. So even though he included these hymns, there are no Sunday school hymns in this book. Likewise, there are no patriotic hymns. And it's also interesting to notice that Quinter made his book a hymn book without music. Hymnals with music had become commonplace in America by this point, but they were still viewed suspiciously by the brethren. And Quinter could have made a hymnal, but he didn't. He just kept with the pattern of making a hymn book. Another thing we see in Quinter's book, once again, there are no German translations in this book. And of all the hymns that Quinter added to this book, once you account for where they come from in other sources, there is only one new hymn in the book. Only one hymn that could have possibly been written by a brethren author. You can find this hymn on page 4. But again, it's just so striking that there are so few brethren-authored hymns in this book, because we know by the mid-1800s there were a number of brethren who were writing and publishing hymns, but Quinter didn't include any of these hymns. Perhaps he didn't want to show favoritism by having more hymns from one writer than from another. Tensions were building in the church at this point. But again, it's just really striking, given that the German hymn books of the brethren had so many brethren-authored hymns, Quinter's book only has one. But despite this, Quinter's book, like we said, really reflects sort of the mainstream of brethren thought during this period well. And it went on to be very widely used by most brethren to the turn of the 20th century. It also served as the basis for the first two attempts at making a hymnal. And so we're briefly going to talk about those before we move on. So the first attempt at a hymnal, a book with printed music in it in addition to the words, came about in 1872. And like we said, this first attempt at a hymnal used the words of the 818 hymns from Quinter's book. This first attempt at a hymnal was made by Henry Holsinger, the very controversial leader of the progressive wing of the church, and Benjamin Funk, who was the son of Joseph Funk of the press here in the Shenandoah Valley. In fact, this first Brethren hymnal was printed in Singer's Glen on the Funk press, and it used the tunes and music from the Harmonia Sacra. So here's what this first Brethren hymnal in 1872 looked like. So it used, again, this is music from like you'd find it in the early editions of the Harmonia Sacra. There's shape notes. It's three-part writing on three different staffs. The melody is in the middle line, which was called the tenor line, and it uses this sort of eclectic mixture of tunes that we find in Harmonia Sacra. So it's basically, again, Quinter's book with tunes from the Harmonia Sacra put to it. Now, this hymnal did not suffer a very kind fate. It was condemned by annual meeting twice. There's queries that came to annual meeting about it the next year in 1873 and the following year in 1874. The answer both times was an emphatic no, we are not going to use this book. And then the Funk press dissolved in 1875, and so the hymnal was only printed once. So it's actually pretty hard to find a copy of this book today because it was only printed once. Now, there's a few reasons why this book suffered the fate that it did. Like we said, the Brethren had long been against using musical notation. They felt like it was worldly, that would lead to the formation of choirs and the adoption of musical instruments. So they'd always kept musical notation at arm's length. Another reason many didn't like this Funk and Holsinger book was because they felt like it was a copyright violation of Quinter's book. By using the hymns he compiled, they were violating copyright. But I think the biggest reason that this book was doomed from the outset was simply because Henry Holsinger's name was attached to it. It is hard to overstate how unpopular of a figure Holsinger was in large parts of the Brotherhood in the 1870s. And because he was associated with the project, it was doomed. And part of the reason I say this is because the next attempt at a Brethren hymnal came about only 7 years later and had a very different fate. So the second attempt at a Brethren hymnal came about in 1879. And this time, the project was undertaken by Quinter himself, along with his partners at the time, the Broombaugh brothers, J.B. and H.B. Broombaugh. They enlisted the help of J.C. Ewing to edit the music for this book. Ewing was the music teacher at Huntington Normal School, which would later become Juniata College. This is what the second Brethren hymnal looks like from 1879. This looks a lot more familiar to us. It still uses shape notes. Anabaptist groups in the 19th century and more traditional ones today still don't like using round notes. Round notes are considered too worldly. This has shape notes. But otherwise, this is standard four-part writing. SATB on two staves like we're used to seeing today. And the tunes in this book are mainstream church music of the late 19th century. So this is just standard American church music in this book, not the more eclectic mix that we have from the Harmonia Sacra. So this second attempt at a Brethren hymnal, it was never officially approved by annual meeting, but it went on to be widely used by the Brethren to the turn of the 20th century. And it's deeply ironic to me that this was the book that the Brethren used instead of the earlier Funk and Holsinger one. Because had they stuck with this first book, with the three-part writing and the sort of different tunes, it would have kept them out of the musical mainstream for longer. But because they went with this book instead, I think it accelerated their progress toward being like other churches. In fact, in the Brethren hymnal of 1879, I have a copy of this one up here too. This is what it looks like. There is a hymn, if you can see this, that has notation specifically for musical instruments. So you see on the third system here, the bass clef line has dotted half notes. That was intended to be played by an organ or a cello, a church viol. This is in the 1879 Brethren Hymnal. Likewise, there's a hymn in this book that has notation for a soloist and for duets. In other words, choral style writing. Now, probably Ewing used these two arrangements because he had to for copyright reasons, if he wanted to use these tunes. But the simple fact that Ewing put these arrangements in the book at all is just kind of mind-boggling to me. The Church of the Brethren wouldn't officially approve the use of musical instruments until 1920. But we see the seeds of this sort of thing much, much earlier in this first Brethren hymnal. So by the late 1870s, the Brethren now have a hymn book and a hymnal, both published and compiled by Quinter. The more traditional-minded among the Brethren probably used the hymn book. The more progressive used the hymnal. But both of these books were widely reprinted and widely used by most Brethren through the turn of the 20th century. They really fit the mainstream of Brethren thought very well. Not everyone in the Brotherhood liked Quinter's books, though. And so the last two books we're going to talk about this evening are books that came about from two different groups within the church who were dissatisfied with a number of different things, including church music. So the fourth book we're going to discuss this evening is the Old Order Hymn Book. Now the old orders as they were called in the church prior to the division of 1881, when Quinter published his book in 1867, they flatly refused to use Quinter's book. They considered it far too progressive. So instead, the people who would become the old orders continued to use the previous book. They continued to use a choice selection of hymns. So for a while, Quinter's book and the old book were being printed at the same time. You had a choice in terms of which one you wanted to use. And the most conservative people in the Brotherhood continued to use a choice selection of hymns. So once the old orders left the main body of the Brethren in 1881 and had their first annual meeting that year, one of the queries that came at that annual meeting was a request to reprint the old book, as they called it, so that they can continue using it in their newly formed Old Order church. Instead of reprinting the old book, however, the decision at that first annual meeting was made instead to form a committee to make a new hymn book. Now, apparently not everybody in the new Old Order Brotherhood liked this decision. In fact, there was one Old Order member from right here in Rockingham County, in Broadway, who wrote a letter to the Vindicator. The Vindicator was the publication that sort of united the Old Orders. So he wrote a letter to the Vindicators asking why they couldn't just keep using the old book. I mean, after all, they're Old Orders. They should just keep using the old book. In the Vindicator, Sam Kinsey wrote a response to this letter. So Sam Kinsey was the editor of the Vindicator. He was also one of the brethren on this new hymn book committee that was commissioned to make this new hymn book. And so he wrote a response to this letter in the Vindicator and explained why the decision was made at annual meeting to make a new book instead of just reprinting the old one. And he gives two reasons. So the first reason that the old orders, the old German Baptists, decided to make a new book is the same reason that Quinter's book came into existence. They said that a choice selection of hymns was simply too small. It didn't have enough hymns in it. They pointed out, Kinsey pointed out that Quinter's book was too big. It's too bulky, it didn't fit well in your pocket. So the consensus at the annual meeting was to make a book of medium size, about 600 hymns, and maybe shorten the hymns a little bit so that you could have a good number of hymns, but the book wouldn't be too bulky. So they wanted to make a book of medium size. But the second reason given for why the old orders decided to make a new hymn book instead of just using the old one is really fascinating. In essence, Sam Kinsey says that older is not necessarily better. Just because this book they've been using for a long time, just because they've been using it, doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't problems with it. He pointed out that there were several hymns in this book that had wording, that had thoughts, that had phrases that weren't in line with a proper understanding of the gospel. And so these hymns needed to be edited to better fit a brethren view of the faith. So again, it's just a really fascinating thought to be coming from the old orders in the 1880s. But older isn't necessarily better. The old book had some issues, and they wanted to fix those issues. So the hymn book committee got to work, and by the following year, they brought their new book to print. The title of the book is a collection of hymns and sacred songs, but we'll just refer to it as the Old German Baptist or the Old Order Hymn Book. Now, one thing the hymn book committee was able to do, even though this is a totally new book with different hymns in it than the old book that they'd used before, they at least made it look like the old book. So you see, this is a choice selection of hymns. It's printed on tan sheepskin, and on the spine is simply the word hymns in a black box. This is a first edition of the Old German Baptist Hymn Book. It's tan sheepskin, the word hymns in a black box on the spine. So even though it was a totally new book, it at least looked like the book that the old brethren used. It looked the part. That's important, right? So, when we look at the contents of this Old Order hymn book, again, there are some really interesting things that we notice. First thing we notice off the bat is that the hymns in this book are not organized alphabetically by first line, like the Christians do in a choice selection of hymns. The hymns are organized by subject or topic, like they were in Quinter's book. So it's just an interesting choice that the committee made in how they arranged their book. Another thing we notice once we start examining the hymns in the book and where they come from, and that is that it's very clear what the primary source for hymns in this book was. Now, what do you think would have been the primary source for hymns in this book? The old book, choice selection? No. The primary source for hymns in the Old Order hymn book is Quinter's book. They use Quinter's book as the starting point, and about 60% of the hymns in this book come from Quinter's book. Now, with that said, they were very critical in how they took hymns from Quinter's book. So certainly none of those more progressive hymns that we highlighted are in this book. So none of the temperance hymns or church dedication hymns or missionary hymns are in the Old Order book. Likewise, of the 13 hymns with choruses in Quinter's book, 4 of them are in the Old Order hymn book, but none of them have a chorus. They all had their choruses removed. They also edited the hymns from Quinter's book. They re-edited Quinter's hymns to be like they had originally been in the old book. So remember we said that there was unique wording of the standard hymns from the Christian's Duty that came from the Winchester books. Quinter made them like what other Christians were singing. Well, the Old Order Hymn Book Committee went back and made them like the older wording in the older book. So they edited them back to that more peculiar wording that they had before. Another thing the Hymn Book Committee did is that they went back and got 17 additional hymns from the old book that weren't in Quinter's book. So Quinter didn't include all of the hymns from the old book in his collection, and the Hymn Book Committee went back and got some that he had left out. Now, once you account for the hymns in the Old Order book that come from Quinter and from a choice selection, another thing you notice is that they did not use the Christian's Duty as a source for hymns at all. You would think that a group that was committed to the ancient order of the Brethren would have used the most ancient English language Brethren hymn book available to them, but they didn't. They didn't use it at all. And I think that says a little bit about who the old orders considered the old brethren to be. If you look at their beliefs and their practices, the old orders really saw the brethren of the early 19th century to be the old brethren rather than the brethren of the 18th century. And you see that reflected, I think, in which books they chose as sources for their book. So about 60% of the book comes from Quinter. The remaining 40% of the hymns in the Old German Baptist hymn book come from all over the place. And this isn't entirely surprising. While they were working on the book, the Hymn Book Committee put a notice in the Vindicator asking church members to submit hymns for inclusion in the book, hymns that they thought would be good to put in this new book. And we see hymns in the book from here, there, and everywhere. So apparently the membership did send in hymns. But even though there's sort of an eclectic mix of hymns, there are at least 2 sources, actual book sources, that the Old Order Committee used. One of them was the Baptist Hymn Book of 1871. The other is the River Brethren Hymn Book of 1876. And again, these books in themselves aren't necessarily that striking. They're just standard hymnals of their day. But what is interesting is that these are, again, pretty new books. Both of these books were less than 10 years old when the Old Order Hymn Book Committee selected hymns for their book. So apparently, just because a hymn was new didn't necessarily mean it was bad to the Old Orders. It just had to fit with their understanding of the faith. So even the Old Orders, at this point, were open to using new hymns in their book. Now, regardless of where a hymn comes from, in the Old Order hymn book, whether it came from Quinter, whether it came from these two books, whether it was submitted by a church member. One thing is very clear. This committee took a heavy hand in how they edited hymns. They sliced and diced hymns. They would take one hymn and slice it into 3 hymns, make 3 hymns out of it. They would take 2 stanzas from one hymn and put another stanza from a different hymn with it. They just totally cut and pasted hymns all over in this book. They also changed wording throughout. We said, Sam Kinsey pointed out that hymns needed to be edited to have a proper understanding of the faith. Well, they did that. There are little changes in wordings to hymns throughout the Old Order hymn book. And there's a number of really interesting things we can see in how they edited hymns, but I'll highlight one in particular. So in this Old Order hymn book, there are no universal restoration hymns. So these 2 hymns on the universal restoration that persisted through Quinter's book are not in the Old Order hymn book. However, one of the ways that the hymn book committee edited hymns was to make sure they at least did not conflict with belief in the universal restoration. So here's an example. This hymn, this is the first 2 stanzas of a hymn in the Old Order hymn book. This hymn came from that River Brethren hymn book of 1876. It's a hymn by Baptist author Ann Steele. If you look at the 2nd stanza, this is how it reads in the Old Order hymn book. It says, "Lo, an eternity there is of bitter woe or endless bliss." That's not what this hymn said originally. In the book that they took this hymn from, it read instead, "Lo, an eternity there is of endless woe or endless bliss." And the committee changed endless woe to bitter woe. Again, so that this hymn, even though it's clearly not a restorationist hymn, it at least does not conflict with belief in the universal restoration. So again, that's just one example, but you'll find little changes in wording throughout the book. They were extremely meticulous in how they edited books and how they edited hymns in this book. And so you will not find a reference to an eternal hell anywhere in the Old German Baptist hymn book. One final unique characteristic of the Old Order hymn book is the number of brethren-authored hymns in the book. So remember we said the 3 books we've talked about so far had very, very few brethren-authored hymns. That's not the case with this Old Order book. There are 63 hymns in the Old Order hymn book that were written by brethren. Over 10% of the collection was from the pen of a brethren author. Of these 63 hymns, 48 of them are from one author in particular, and that's Sam Kinsey, the one we've been discussing, who was the editor of the Vindicator, and who was also on the hymn book committee. Kinsey had published a collection of hymns of his own several years prior to this book. He also tended to write hymns for inclusion in the Vindicator. So Kinsey is actually the 2nd most frequently represented hymn writer in the Old German Baptist hymn book after Isaac Watts, and has more hymns to his name than the next 2 authors combined. So between Kinsey's hymns and hymns from other brethren writers, 15 additional hymns, this book has a really characteristic flavor because of these hymns. Many of these brethren-authored hymns are hymns on the ordinances or on other distinctives, like there's a hymn on the free ministry, there's a hymn on church discipline, and things like that. And unfortunately, 63 hymns, I couldn't include all of them on your handout. But there are some really, really interesting hymns in this book. Now, you can make the argument that this Old Order hymn book of 1882 was more characteristically brethren than any of the books that came before it. In fact, you could even argue that it's the most distinctively brethren hymn book ever published, at least from a classical view of brethren thinking. But it's deeply ironic to me that to make such a characteristically brethren book, the Old Orders had to make such a radical break with the established hymn tradition of the Brethren in 1882. So even though it's a book that fits an old Brethren understanding well, it was a very new book when it appeared in 1882. Now, since then, the Old German Baptists have continued to use this hymn book. They have continued to publish it, and it is still their hymn book that they use in their church to this day. And because of that, it's served as sort of a theological anchor for that fellowship for quite a while now. And that brings us to our last book of the evening, sort of a counterpoint to the one we were just talking about. Like we said, there were some in the Brotherhood who really didn't like Quinter's book. We talked about one group, the Old Orders, and now we're going to talk about another group, the Progressives. So kind of like the old orders, once the Progressives were disfellowshipped in 1882 and then formed as a separate church in 1883, one of the first decisions that they made was also to print a new collection of hymns. So they appointed a committee to this task, and this committee got to work. Kind of like what happened with Quinter, though, there was one member of the committee that did most of the work himself, and that was J.C. Ewing. Remember, we mentioned him earlier. He was the compiler of Quinter's hymnal. When the division happened, J.C. Ewing became the music teacher at Ashland College, which was the college associated with the newly formed Brethren Church. So this book, when they brought it to print the following year, was entitled The Brethren Hymnody with Tunes. And it is a hymnal, so it has music in it. So we said, Quinter in the mainstream of the Brethren had a hymn book and a hymnal. The old orders printed only a hymn book. The Progressives printed only a hymnal with music. As you can see, this is not an original copy of the Brethren Hymnody. This is a reprint. If any of you know where I can find a copy of this book, please let me know. I've been looking for a copy of this book for 10 years now and have not been able to find one. It's very difficult to find, and you'll find out why here in just a little bit. So this hymnal that Ewing put together for the Progressives is actually a fairly small book. It has only 324 hymns in it. It's a lot smaller than the last few books that we've been talking about. When you start looking at the contents of this progressive hymnal of 1884, you also notice a number of really interesting things. The hymns in this book are arranged in a different way than any of the books that come before it. They're actually arranged by the kind of hymn. We'll get to that more in a moment. But another thing that immediately strikes you when you start looking at this book, except for the fact that the title is The Brethren Hymnody, there's really nothing about this book that is characteristically Brethren at all. When you look at the table of contents, there are no feet-washing hymns. There are no hymns on any of the more distinctive ordinances. There are no non-resistance hymns. But what you do see are categories of hymns that even Quinter was hesitant to include in his book in 1867. So if you look at the table of contents, there's a section of missionary hymns, of revival hymns, of Sunday school hymns, and even, get this, patriotic hymns. There are patriotic hymns in the Progressive Brethren Hymnal of 1884. And again, this is just really fascinating when you compare this book with the Old Order hymn book that appeared just 2 years before, and you consider that these folks were all part of the same church until just relatively recently. It's really fascinating that the church even held together as long as it did when you see the differences between these two books. Another thing you notice when you look at the hymns themselves in this book is that it's very clear that Ewing did not use any of the previous books as a source for hymns. Only 40% of the hymns in the book, and again, this is a pretty small book, only 40% of the hymns in this book are in Quinter's book. And all of those hymns that are in Quinter's book are the more mainstream hymns that you find in Quinter's book. So the more distinctive hymns that came from the Winchester books, the few hymns that were written by brethren, none of them are in Ewing's book. In terms of how the book is laid out, it's divided into 3 parts. And like we said, it's organized by the kind of hymn. So Ewing describes these sections in the preface to his book. And this comes directly from his preface. So part 1 of the book is a compilation of what he calls the old standard metrical hymns and tunes. So the first part of the book are metrical hymns that don't have choruses. So the sorts of hymns that were the style of hymn that was characteristic of the earlier books. The second part of the book contains what he calls favorites of the later variety. In other words, gospel hymnody, hymns with choruses. So Quinter was sort of hesitant to include hymns with choruses in his book. There were only 13. Ewing puts an entire section of these hymns in his book. And the third part of the book is very short, and as it says, it consists of a selection of hymn tunes, anthems, and chants which are not intended for congregational use. We'll get to those here in a minute. So let's just briefly go through the 3 parts of this book. The first part, like we said, is what Ewing called old standard metrical hymns. So you can see there's a number of hymns here on this 2-page spread that are all common meter hymns, and there are 2 common meter tunes at the top. Now, These old standard hymns, there's some really fascinating things we can see about them. First of all, about half of these old standard hymns in Ewing's book had never been in a Brethren hymn book before. Think about that. Half of the old standard hymns in the progressive hymnal had never before been in a Brethren hymn book. What that demonstrates, I think, very clearly is the progressive self-understanding. They didn't think of them as a nonconformist sect like the Brethren had thought of themselves for so long. They thought of themselves as really just one part of a larger American church. And so these old standard hymns are simply old standard hymns that other people in America had been singing for a long time. Another really unique thing about the hymns in this first part of his book is that there are 15 hymns in this section that Ewing added to his book that the old orders also added to their book. 15 hymns. Now, so these hymns, some of them are hymns about the Bible, some of them are hymns about Jesus. But both the progressives and the old orders added these same 15 hymns to their two collections. And what I think this shows is that when you talk about doctrine or belief in the abstract, there wasn't really that much difference between the old orders and the progressives. The difference came in how they lived out their belief. And one final thing I'll point out while we're here, notice round notes, not shaped notes. Ewing didn't have any qualms about round notes in his book. So this is the first part of the book. The second part of the book is, again, gospel hymnody, hymns with choruses. So here's a couple examples of hymns from the second part of the book. By this point in time, hymns with choruses were very commonplace in American church music, but they were still controversial among groups like the Brethren. They were considered to be too contemporary, too worldly. But the hymns in this section, a lot of them today we would consider to be old classics. So this second part of Ewing's book included hymns like What a Friend We Have in Jesus, I Love to Tell the Story, Shall We Gather at the River, Jesus Keep Me Near the Cross, Bringing in the Sheaves, so on and so forth. But it's important to remember that even though we would consider these to be sort of old classic hymns today, they were pretty controversial in a lot of the brotherhood at the time. Ewing, again, put a whole section of them in here. Another unique thing about this book, there are only 3 possibly Brethren authored hymns in this book, so again, following the pattern set by Liebert, but there are 13 tunes in this book that were written by Ewing. So while there aren't a lot of unique texts in the book, Ewing did write some of the music. And in this way, he set a pattern for other Brethren tune writers to follow in the Church of the Brethren in the coming years. Folks like William Bergey, George B. Holsinger, J. Henry Showalter, and people like that. We actually have one of Ewing's tunes that he wrote here on this page, and I'll just point out, notice, it's got notation for musical instruments. So there are songs like this throughout the progressive hymnal that have notation for instruments, and Ewing himself actually wrote some of them. And then the third section of the book, we said, was very short. It contains choral anthems, in other words, more difficult arrangement of hymns that would be too hard for a congregation to sing, and chant texts. So here you can see, this is a 2-page spread. This is the last page of a choral anthem, so it was a multi-page arrangement. And then you have chant texts in this progressive Brethren hymnal of 1884. That blows my mind every time I think about it. Because chant text you think of with like liturgical church settings, robed choirs, high church worship. But there's a section of chant texts in this progressive hymnal of 1884. It's just really fascinating. Now, ultimately, this progressive hymnal was not used by the Brethren Church. It was only printed once, and there may have been a few congregations that used it for a little bit, but by and large, the progressives did not use this hymnal. And that begs the question, why? So there's 2 possibilities. It's possible that this book may have been too progressive even for the progressives. With patriotic hymns and chant texts, it might have been out of the comfort level of some of the newly formed progressive church. But I don't think that's the case. I think that instead, this book was not used because it was too ordinary. Prior to the division, it's likely that the progressives already were not using Quinter's books. They were already using just mainstream American evangelical hymnals. And so when this book came out, it was kind of like, what's the point? Why would we use this book that has fewer hymns than the hymnals that we're already using? And so they just didn't use it. And the reason I think that's the case is because that's the pattern that the progressive brethren have followed to this day. The Brethren Church and then the Grace Brethren Church have not published their own hymnals. They've simply used mainstream hymnals that are available in their worship services. And that really started here in 1884. So, in summary, by the time we get to the early 1880s, we see the emergence of three very distinct streams of Brethren hymnody. On the one hand, we have the old orders, who printed a new hymn book in 1882, but have continued to use that same hymn book to this day. On the other hand, we have the progressives, who also printed a new hymnal in 1884, but never really used it. And they've just used mainstream American evangelical hymnals to this day. And in the middle, we have the main body of the Brethren, which became the Church of the Brethren in 1908. And the Church of the Brethren has largely continued in the same pattern that Liebert established with the Christian's Duty and that Quinter continued in 1867, of selecting, with each new generation, producing a new hymnal, selecting new hymns, including some old hymns, and editing the book in a way that it in some way or another reflects the nature and character of the church of its time. Well, I hope this has been interesting. Like I said, there's so much more detail I wish I could have shared with you. We were just really hitting the high points. But I hope if nothing else, this has piqued your curiosity in these old books and maybe will inspire you to dust off some old books you have on your shelf and see what you might find in them too. So at this point, Paul's coming up. I think we're going to go ahead and break for our refreshments. If you have questions, I'd love to hear your questions at our break, but we want to be cognizant of the time, so we'll leave time for Ben.
Thank you, Sam, for that cursory but intriguing journey through the hymnals. It's just been fascinating to learn that progressive, and thank you for your research on it and sharing. We're going to take about a 25-minute break. It gives you a chance to go to the restrooms. The refreshments are out on this entry lobby over here to my right. When you come out, go out through the sanctuary doors, turn to your right, and it's out there, and you can pick those up there. And I will be the timekeeper to get us back in here for the second segment with Ben Bergey. And there will be something else that you will need to pick up when you come back in. Again, there are offering plates back at the end of the sanctuary for you to make contributions for this lecture series and to support the Brethren Mennonite Heritage Center. You're dismissed now for a break, and I'll call you back when it's time.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3. Hello, 1, 2, 3. Check. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome back for Hymnody Part 2. If you have not yet picked up a hymnal, a new Mennonite hymnal called Voices Together, you will need that for this time. We want to welcome Ben Bergey, Benjamin Bergey. Most people just call him Ben. He's an active song leader and conductor. He's assistant professor of music at Eastern Mennonite University, where he conducts choirs and orchestra and teaches music theory and conducting. He also advises the new music and peace-building major. In addition to serving as music editor for Voices Together, he is a director of music at Harrisonburg Mennonite Church and conducts the Rapidan Orchestra. Welcome, Ben, for this engaging second lecture. Ben.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming and for the invitation to speak with you about Voices Together. So my plan for our time is to first give a very brief overview to the process and the project that brought forth this hymnal, Voices Together, and then look at many of the wonderful Anabaptist contributions that can be found in it through some background, some stories, and even some singing together. So this was a 4-year process of creating a new hymnal for Mennonite Church USA and Mennonite Church Canada. And I served as the music editor for it and also compiler and editor for the accompaniment edition. So it was quite an undertaking, as it was in a timeline that was to be done in about half the time of the Blue Hymnal Worship Book. Although we had email and the internet, and so some of those kinds of things, I suppose, sped up the process. So we gathered for the first time in September of 2016, and we gathered with gratitude and wonder as we all recognized that this was quite a privilege and an honor to be a part of this, and we also gathered with lots of questions. Questions like, how would we listen to the church? How would we listen to the Spirit? How would we decide what to carry forward? How would we organize ourselves? What processes to create? And how to do it in half the time as the previous committee? How would we decide what to preserve from previous collections? And how to decide out of all of the new material? How do we balance musical priorities, textual priorities, aspects of the church year or the table of contents, styles, time periods, and the list goes on and on. We, of course, needed to separate our personal preferences from the call and discernment of the whole church. After all, we weren't making a hymnal for ourselves or for our home congregations, but one that could resource the breadth of the denominations. So we spent the first year listening to the broader church through surveys, meetings, conferences, visits, samplers, informal conversations. We searched for people's heart songs. So that was one of the biggest first surveys, was a heart song survey. Looking for stories, what values they had for this new collection. Everyone is invested in this book that we use in worship. And in addition to assessing content from the previous collections, which for us was most notably the Blue Hymnal Worship Book and the two supplements that came after, Sing the Journey and Sing the Story, but it took so long to say those names that we just called that collection the Trilogy. So, in addition to assessing the Trilogy, we also looked at things from previous hymnals, previous denominational hymnals, and then we screened tens of thousands of songs and worship resources from sources outside of Anabaptist collections. And this included open submissions, a web portal that we opened to collect things. And that brought in many items. And then we also looked in curated collections, single author and single composer collections, other recent ecumenical hymnals, Mennonite World Conference songbooks, other world songbooks, contemporary worship music, and there's a lot as you get into it. And in addition to listening in the first year and also mounting the learning curve of a hymnal committee, I mentioned also we opened the submissions portal, and that was for people to submit items for consideration to this project. And this brought in texts, tunes, songs, instrumental accompaniments, worship resources and words for worship, artwork. Some things were by the submitter or creator themselves. Others submitted work on behalf of someone else that perhaps had been important in their worshiping community that they thought we should take a look at. And all told, we received about 2,300 items through that web portal. And many were written by Anabaptists. And then, like I said, we searched those other collections and streams of content, leading to about 10,000 songs screened and 20,000 worship resources reviewed. So just to give a picture into some of our questions and what it was like at the initial stage, one of our first exercises was to list 100 essential songs from Hymnal Worship Book. The premise being, suppose you could only take 100 songs from the collection into the next, at that time, unnamed collection. What would it be? Questions emerged right away, of course, like, are these to be 100 favorites or most used? Should they span the church year across the 100 that we select? Should they span acts of worship? What factors need to be held in balance? How do I balance theological and musical priorities? How do I not end up with just gathering and sending songs and my favorite Christmas songs? So it posed many dilemmas and brought essential questions into the foreground. We looked at everyone's hypothetical choices side by side and observed our selection in aggregate. And amidst these discussions, we began the imperfect work of separating our personal preferences from decision-making as a group. After all, we weren't creating, like I said, for any one particular group, but trying to resource for the breadth of the denominations. And then we did a second pass through the trilogy. And in that second pass, we rated each song on a 5-point scale, 1 being problematic and 5 being essential. And this gave us an aggregate score as a committee for each hymn. And when giving a score of 3 or less, we then rated each text and tune separately. Since perhaps a tune might still have benefit being with a new text, that it was being held back or something, or a text still has wonderful life in it, but perhaps it needs more usable or friendly or simply a better pairing of synergy with a new tune. And so this preliminary data drawn from the second pass was simply a beginning point to help focus our discussion. And so that gives you just a peek into some of the thoughts and things that we had to hold in balance. This infographic, which I recognize is illegible at a great distance, can be found online, which I'll mention, and it just shows, going from the top, our total stream of content of 10,000 plus things, and it shows the process going down to the curated collection and some of the things that happened along the way to end up with the 765 songs that are in Voices Together. And it can actually be found in a resource, a table of contents resource on the website, which is voicestogetherhymnal.org/resources. And while I'm mentioning the website, it is an interesting place to look around when you have some time and some interest in it. We've written many guides, we've written blog posts, we've done virtual launches that have been recorded, resourcing events, all kinds of things, and those can all be found on the Voices Together website. First time we get a website for a denominational hymnal. So every piece under consideration, regardless of its point of entry into this workflow, was evaluated then on strengths and weaknesses as a committee, because we decided that anything that would end up having gone into Voices Together would have gone through in-person discussion as a committee, and then on into subcommittee work to discern any potential edits based on feedback from the committee, and then of course to go through simply the editing process of getting onto the page. So after the first year I mentioned, then we spent the next couple years through the blessing of thousands of Google Docs and dozens of Google spreadsheets, countless Zoom meetings, and that was before everyone else was doing it. We did it before it was cool. And then we also had 10 in-person meetings, which amounted to a full 2 months of in-person meetings. Zooming in on the box on the right to make that a little bit larger, this shows consulting groups. And so we reached out to dozens of other experts. So we were a committee of about 14 people, and we of course did not represent the entire body of the two denominations. And so we drew in a lot of other people into the process, experts and consultants representing different expertises and constituencies who are more qualified to speak into those pieces, especially when those represented voices had tended to be underrepresented in processes before. So some ask, why a new hymnal? One of the reasons is that it was around the time to provide new resources, new perspectives, to be able to continue to sing a new song to the Lord. And hymnals are generational, as we have seen and heard, with, on average for us, at least about 20 to 30 years between each one, and the Blue Hymnal came out in 1992. As wonderful new material comes out, it's able to be added into the potential canon, and perhaps even replace some things that didn't get used as much, albeit through very challenging decisions at times. A hymnal is a living theological document, and so we took our role very seriously as a committee. We sought to build off of the important theology and history of Anabaptist worship, and each new collection calls for new songs and resources, new perspectives, and gaps that can be filled to resource topics and concerns of the day. In this case, things like creation care, being able to sing lament, or expanding representation. A collection of worship resources and songs is difficult to curate for a diverse population across two denominations in two countries. And so our goal was for it to be both representational, to be able to resource our broad congregations, and to be prophetic to God's call for this next generation. So a little over half of the material in Voices Together is from previous collections. And you can see that I'll just say it because you probably can't see it. The blue section here represents material from Hymnal Worship Book. This represents material from Sing the Journey and Sing the Story, so the two Mennonite supplements. This represents a text or tune from the trilogy. And this represents material from even before that that wasn't in the trilogy. And then new material. And so that means that, a little under half there is new. With wonderful, creative things written since the last collection, new images and ideas, things from Mennonite World Conference songbooks, as well as some things that haven't been in the collection for a while, or perhaps just repurposed with a new text or a new tune. And there are also now songs in every language spoken as primary in Mennonite worshiping communities in North America, and that number is over 25. So we sought to have a breadth and a balance of things in Voices Together. After all, most congregations sing roughly between 100 and 200 songs, and this collection has 765 songs. So breadth in terms of a lot of different categories and criteria. This includes musical genres and idioms, a breadth of texts and registers of language, images used, as well as breadth of time periods and sources from which they come. And we have several resources similar to this that show different aspects and different data through infographics. So this one is by century, with most current on that side, and working backwards by century. Tunes show on a bar graph on the top and texts on bar graph below. And then there are other ones by country or source region. There's even a pie chart on 4-part, unison, and everything in between. So you can find those also on the website if you're interested. And also, this just shows the different formats and editions that came out with this hymnal. It's called the Suite of Products, and there's this is the most known that you have, hopefully, with you right now. A large print edition, a tablet edition, there's an app now for that. A worship leader edition, which is really intended as supplemental and essays with a lot of different topics, but not just for music leaders, pastors, that kind of thing. And then audio CDs available as MP3 downloads, and of course an accompaniment edition that is for more beyond just keyboards accompaniment, but other instruments, some essays, and there are reference notes in there as well as online that can be accessed free online with things, some context information, some background or historical information, performance practice of how certain things, especially global songs, might be used, those types of things. And the projection edition, which includes all the texts, artwork, beautiful projectable music, like what you can see here, that has much larger text and can be readable on large screens. And each song was re-engraved specifically to be able to be projected with only one verse between the staves so that the text can be much larger. Because if you've ever tried to sing with someone who just snapped a photo of a hymnal page and tried to project that, it really does not work. So there's a lot more I can say on all parts of the process and what it's like and the approaches we took. But much of that has indeed been outlined and recorded in launch events and things that you're welcome to watch on YouTube or through the website. And I would like to spend some more time specifically on Anabaptist content in the collection. Because we're happy to say that Voices Together does have more Anabaptist created content than any of our other previous Mennonite hymnals, denominational hymnals, and now a large portion of content, of course, in most mainstream ecumenical hymnals is ecumenically shared. And there is, of course, value in having things in common with the wider Christian church and acknowledging that we indeed do hold much in common. So, of course, we also carefully curated ecumenical material, especially for things that we shared theology and perspectives that are in line with our own. But about 131 songs were written by Anabaptists, with about 40 or so more songs with harmonizations and adaptations, which is about 22% of the collection's total. And then 110 worship resources, plus the 12 pieces of visual art that you can find throughout, were written by Anabaptists, which is about 39% of the total worship resource content. So the result is, of course, that our hymnal then, while connecting us to the wider Christian church, also has a distinctively Anabaptist flavor. So I'd like to go through some of the lists of Anabaptist songs by century, by category, sharing some stories and background on them, and we'll even sing some of them. Now, this was pretty hard to do for this lecture, as my short list to talk about was over 50 initially. So it's likely that people in this room or watching online possibly have contributed in some way to the project, but may not be highlighted in this talk. So I want to take a moment to thank everyone for their role, because some were screeners, helping to sift through the initial tens of thousands of selections. Others consulted on a couple dozen consulting groups. Others filled out heart song surveys or presented other means of communication. Some tested materials through samplers that we sent out. Some donated money to help make the project viable. Others prayed for us along the way. And still others helped create selections that were either chosen or not for inclusion in Voices Together. And I am grateful to each and every one of those thousands of people. It indeed took a large village to create this worship book, and that village even spanned across centuries of creatives. So looking back to the earliest Anabaptist sources, there are 13 songs originating from 16th century Anabaptist sources, which is over half actually of the 16th century material in Voices Together. And so of course 7 of those were from the Ausbund, which had a core of 51 hymns published in 1564, and then the first full publication was published in 1583. And it's the oldest Anabaptist songbook and one of the oldest Christian songbooks still in continuous use. And if this collection is new, it was written by early Anabaptists while imprisoned in the dungeons of Passau. So looking at a few of these, number 45, and the numbers correspond if you want to sometimes quick flip through and look at things or not, is O Gott Vater, which is with one of the two tunes that was likely used with it in the 16th century. Now, if you're familiar with it in Hymnal Worship Book, it was a transcription of modern day practice in that area of Amish by Joseph Yoder, but generally doesn't really bear resemblance to the 16th century tune itself. The tune here was a tune known at that time, especially with a Lutheran text that centered on the sola fide doctrine, or faith alone, that through faith and not just deeds that were reconciled. And so often there are these intertextual relationships because of having shared tunes. As Sam had mentioned, early collections often just had the texts, and that would then be paired with some familiar tunes and that kind of thing. So, number 399, The Word of God is Solid Ground, is a martyr's song, and we're not sure which tune it would have been set to or sung with in the Ausbund, but J. Harold Moyer had set a tune in Hymnal Worship Book, and that pairing continues. 444, I Sing with Exultation, was written by Felix Manz, and then even adapted and translated by other Anabaptists. 571, we will sing, O God, we read the Holy Law. So this was written by Michael Schneider and translated by Scott Troyer, and it's set with Ein Festeborg, which was the traditional setting for this text. And an interesting intertextuality is a sort of correction of sorts by using some of the images, the militant images that we also find in A Mighty Fortress, which is, of course, the text we know with this tune, but to describe Jesus' peace and call to love each other. So it's an interesting re-envisioning, and in fact, it comes from Schneider's, it's a very long 22-verse exegesis of looking at Jesus' call to love and peace. We sadly only chose 3 of those for inclusion. 576, Now Who Would Follow Christ, another martyr's song without a known tune, and then translated by David Augsburger for the 1969 Mennonite hymnal, and that continues today. 583, O Christ, impart your teaching true, translated by Father Myron Augsburger, and set to a different tune than before, this time Maritone. And while I would love to talk about tune pairings, I would have to save that for another time. And finally, the 7th Ausbund example is 630, Everlasting God, which was a text written by Anneline of Freiburg. And then Susan Naustengler set this text to a new meter, and Annelie Leptisen composed a new tune for this. So it's a wonderful collaboration by Anabaptist women across centuries. But I mentioned we'll sing number 571. So let's warm up with it, and it's the rhythmic version of Ein feste Burg. So let's sing together. We'll do verses 1 and 3. And I'll play along just to help support. Together. O God, we read the holy law to shape our living, like those who first in fear and awe received it with thanksgiving. These laws that Jesus knew, he summarized with two that capture best the whole with heart and soul. Love God and love your neighbor. Verse 3. So let our love for God be known in how we treat creation. True love in word and action shown to every tongue and nation. If we would heed this call and offer to all, then we must surely praise our source of love always. To God alone be glory. And I'd mentioned there were 13 16th century Anabaptist songs. The other 6 are adapted from other sources, such as prose or composites of other prose and songs. First being 402, Rejoice, Rejoice, a text by Balthasar Hupmeyer, and then set to a tune that actually is from the Harmonia Sacra, so a nice 16th and 19th century Anabaptist fusion. 749, Jesus Christ is Love Divine, based on divine, not diving, based on the writings of Pilgrim Marpeck, and then Nathan Grieser, a living Mennonite composer, set her text to a new tune. So a 16th and 21st century fusion. 797 is one that may be familiar. We Are People of God's Peace. This has had a couple translations and originated back in Mennonite World Conference songbooks. And so we went back around to Menno's texts and added one other verse. Since we're not always as good at being people of God's peace as the initial 3 verses alluded to, and Menno knew it as well, as it was also in that text. And I think we will try to sing that one. 439, True Evangelical Faith. This has been set to a couple of different settings. You may know 1 or 2 of them. Jeremy Kempf, the one that is included in this collection, had taught it several times in Mennonite Church USA conventions. It's a text by Menno Simons and based on a paragraph in a longer pamphlet, which is called, the pamphlet's called The Reason Menno Simons Does Not Cease Teaching and Writing, written by himself. 434, O God, Our Refuge, a composite writing done by several different Anabaptist women who have often been at the forefront of the movement, and uses a newly composed tune by the Walking Roots Band, which is actually a locally based Mennonite Americana folky type of group. And 475, another Pilgrim Marpeck text, Spirit, Do Your Work in Us, from some of her writings. So why don't we sing 797, We Are People of God's Peace, to experience that new, that other verse that we came upon in Menno's writings. And to get into it, we'll sing the first verse. So we'll sing the first 2 verses. We are people of God's peace, as a new creation. Love unites and strengthens us at this celebration. Sons and daughters of the Lord, serving one another, a new covenant of peace binds us all together. We are heralds of God's peace for the new creation, and by grace the word of peace reaches every nation. Though we falter and we fail, Christ will still renew us. By the Holy Spirit's power, God is working through us. And it, of course, goes on to the final 2 verses that you're possibly familiar with. And Anabaptist songwriting continues to be a living tradition from 16th century through to current songwriters. Looking at just a couple here written in the 18th and 19th century, 515, O Little Children Gather, written by famous Mennonite school teacher Christopher Dock, and 577, Count Well the Cost by Alexander Mack Sr., and 496, I Owe the Lord a Morning Song, text and tune by Amos Hare. And of course, many more then came from the last 50 years or so, with a large increase happening since the last collection. Some Anabaptist contributions have been translations, harmonizations of another tune, perhaps written a text or a tune or both, wrote accompaniments, worship resources, provided art in many mediums, wrote essays for worship leader editions, volunteered on screening committees, consulted in areas where they're experts, and the list goes on and on. Some of the materials from 20th century songs that have still been in previous collections and continue today, and this is just a sampling. 161, I Sought the Lord, a J. Harold Moyer tune. 409, For We Are Strangers No More, Kenneth Morse and Diane Hoffman Morningstar. 40 is an interesting example. In Thy Holy Place We Bow, written by J.D. Brunk and S.F. Kaufman, who were the text and tune editors of the old black hymnal, the Mennonite Church and Sunday School hymnal. They wrote that one together, and it's continued in several collections since, and not equal, but a comparison would be 483 word and sign. So that's an interesting example because it was written by both Adam Tice and I, the text and tune editors, but where we hadn't known that to be the case in the process at the time. So the administrative assistant would anonymize everything that came into our process so that we didn't know who wrote any of them. Living, dead, didn't matter. And that helped us it was sort of like a blind audition. We just could see it for what it was. And so the text that became the text for 483 had come through the screening process, and anonymously, obviously, and I saw that it did not have a tune, nor was it in a particularly common meter that I thought would likely have one that we could find. And I generally screen while I'm at the piano, and I felt some inspiration to just start singing along with it. And before long, I had had a melody and a chord progression, and added it then to the screening material. And again, everyone then would encounter that anonymously. And after reviewing it and discussion, it received a high enough score, and sure enough, came to be in the collection. And at that point, once it had been discussed, then we had realized what had happened, that the text and tune were written by people in the room. And so it was sort of fun to realize that we would have one of those, similar to JD and SF. 548, Open Lord My Inward Ear by local Mennonite Brad Lehman. And of course 622, Jesus Rock of Ages by J.D. Martin. And like I said, this is just a selection. And then contemporary hymnody that can have some new ideas or other new things, some gaps that can be filled, some things we hadn't been able to sing before, new ways of thinking about things, or simply new words for things that we've thought about. Or maybe there just weren't enough options of something. So that is when some of the new things can come in. And so here are some examples. 209, We Dream of a Turning, which is adding more songs and more words for talking about creation care and stewardship of that which is around us. 148, In Words of Truth. This is a challenging text, one that allows us to grapple with what do we do when we encounter pain, and when that pain comes from people we love or even comes from the church. 299, God Lights a Lamp. This uses the parable of the woman who is searching for her lost treasure, lost coin, and this song allows us to sing feminine imagery for God in the way that Jesus had shown. 42, Could It Be That God is Singing? A beautiful text written by a poet, Becca Lockman, and it's set to a tune that some might know that's most associated with Hark I Hear the Harps Eternal, with a lovely Alice Parker harmonization. 603, Still My Soul. This is a song that some may see better suited for a soloist, but doesn't need to be that way. As with some unison songs, the range is a bit larger. But it also expands harmonic content in the hymnal, and it also gives space for meditation, which we heard people show appreciation for with songs that entered hymnal worship book, like Through Our Fragmentary Prayers, and that sort of to allow that sort of space. And 612, Hold On. This is a particularly poignant text and tune. It was actually written in the wake of a suicide by a family member, and it allows for people to bring themselves to church even when they're grieving, even when they're doubting or hurting, and gives the congregation a chance to say that it's okay and that we will hold on to you, as will God. And so, although I would love to sing all of these, we are going to sing two of them. Number 42, Could It Be That God is Singing? 42. And we'll sing all three verses here. And we'll also sing 612 from this list, When Pain or Sorrow. And I'll sing through the first verse. So I will invite you to listen for that verse while you hear and learn it. And then feel free to join on the other two verses as you feel comfortable or when pain or sorrow is too much to bear, when your heart feels numb, unable to care, when faith seems so pointless that you cannot pray, when no one knows quite what to say, then hold on to find a way to get through. And when your hope is gone and you can't hold on, we will hold on to you. If God is silent when you need to hear that you're not alone, that comfort is near, if you are abandoned when you need a friend, and you can't hold on, we will hold on to you. And when it looks like there's no end in sight, know all that is long can still be made right. You're never alone. God has promised to be with us even when we can see. So hold on to find a way to get through. And when your hope is gone and you can't hold on, we will hold on to you. The next is a broad category with many different styles. Some might sound similar to how you might describe contemporary worship music. Others you might have learned at camp. Others have been written by singer-songwriters or bands, and still others might be more like folk or bluegrass. So sometimes we needed to make categories, as messy as categories can be, and needed to lump diverse or disparate or unlumpable things together. So we called this popular idiom, or PI, and yes, we had a separate subcommittee for it. We had many subcommittees. And it includes, it's mostly from 21st century, or although some late 20th century, including number 11, Mountain of God, written by Ontario Mennonite Phil Campbell Enns, 202, Peace Be Still, written by Brethren Sean Kirchner, 389, and that's an interesting, we have several Sean Kirchner, but the Peace Be Still is a 12-part round, and it builds and adds and becomes almost like this improvisatory, beautiful conglomeration of people singing peace, be still, peace, peace. 389, Together, written again by Nathan Greaser. Many have learned it at Mennonite Church USA assemblies. 394, God Calls Us to Be Followers of Christ. That actually is a song setting of the Mennonite Church USA vision statement of calling for healing and hope. 591, When I Can't Find My Way, written by a Mennonite pastor in southeastern Pennsylvania, Jessica Hedrick Miller. Solemn Stillness, Weary Streets, 276, by a husband and wife Harrisonburg duo, Christopher and Maria Clymer-Kurtz. 763, Waterfall. Many MYFers would have learned that at convention through Mennonite Church USA, and also as in camp songs. 777, Seeds, another example of the Walking Roots Band. 779, You're Not Alone, one that actually is from Brian Moyer Suderman, a Canadian Mennonite that has been picked up in several World Conference songbooks. 789, Be a Sower, Plant a Seed. That is by a songwriting collective called Camps with Meaning, a Manitoba-based camp, Mennonite camp, that is essentially a songwriting collective and has written many, many of their own songs that they use at camp. And so we screened through some of those, and there are two instances of, in Voices Together. A wonderful Anabaptist flavor written by youth and young adults. So, and then 828, Wild Hope. So some texts then were also sent out, texts that we had that at that point did not have a pairing decided, a tune to go with it yet decided, and thought that some of those would be really great if we could actually have Mennonites write a tune specifically for that text. And so we actually sent out 8 examples, 8 texts that we were interested in seeing people's inspirations and creative writing, and we received 75 tunes back for those 8 texts. So that was hard. That was very hard. And we were able to use a couple tunes then in other instances as well, but it was wonderful to see so much engagement for those things. And let's sing number 777, a short song, easily memorizable. Some may even know it if you are familiar with some of the Walking Roots Band material. Together. These seeds you have sown in our hearts and in our bones, cover them with your love. Use our hands, use our feet to show your love and your peace, and cover us, cover us. One more time. These seeds you have sown in our hearts and in our bones, cover them with your love. Use our hands, use our feet to show your love and your peace, and cover us, cover us with love. A category that I decided to call Old Wine in New Wineskins, where we didn't have any of the elements before in previous collections, but it came from older material and repurposed in I think all of these ways, almost in new tunes in some way. 142, God Grant Us Mercy. This uses an 8th century text by Cassia, and it's sort of in the Ubi Caritas chant where the congregation sings just a shorter chant snippet in response, as sort of antiphonal type of thing. It has that in the Pew edition, the book that you're holding, and then the leader can sing some of the other material which can be found in the accompaniment edition, and then the congregation continues to respond with that short phrase, that God grants us mercy and forgiveness. 539, God speaks to us in bird and song, not quite as old, a 19th century text, but one that we hadn't encountered before, and then set to a lovely new tune specifically written for it by Mennonite Pax Ressler. And then 663, I Am That Great and Fiery Force. This, we had a Hildegard text come to us, so Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century mystic, well known for many of her spiritual writings, many texts and chants. And so when I saw it as a text that came to us, without a tune, without any suggestion about how to use it, and my first thought was to see, well, is there some pairing of hers that we could use because she wrote texts and tunes. Now, they were chants, and that's not exactly something that has typically been used to pair with texts. And so spent some time in many of her Holy Spirit chants, as this text was a Holy Spirit text, and found something that seemed like the progression of short and long could sort of fit with this. And so it's a part then of a longer chant, and then what I did was just metricize it, so put it into a meter that could be more followed for those that tend to see a chant and keep turning pages. So this allows us to sing in a different way, both a Hildegard text and a Hildegard tune. So we'll give that a try. So number 663. It is also one that is a little bit easier to just hear it the first time and then join. So I would invite you to listen as I sing the first verse, and then feel free to join me on the second and third. I am that great and fiery force, sparkling in everything that lives, in shining of the river's course, in greening grass that glory gives. I shine and glitter on the seas, in burning sun, in moon and stars, in unseen wind, in verdant trees. I breathe within, both near and far. And for the last verse, feel free, if you would rather, to just hum one of those pitches as well. So if you want to sing that, maybe start the humming. And others on verse 3. And where I breathe, there is no death, and meadows glow with beauty's rife. I am in all the Spirit's breath, the thundered word, for I am life. And so the longer notes correspond with the longer neumes of the chant, and shorter with the shorter ones. So some global songs written by Mennonites, as well as Mennonite songs from North America that are of non-English origin. Number 26, O Prince of Peace, some might actually know from Hymnal Worship Book. It was in there, as well as some Mennonite World Conference songbooks written by Septo Joadi from Indonesia. 562, Duladu Shidi Indah, written by a Navajo Mennonite, Daniel Smiley from the U.S. The next two, 59 and 8, Ehane Heama, Father God, you are holy, and Jesus, Lord, how joyful you have made us. Both having been in Hymnal Worship Book from the Cheyenne Mennonite community. They had had a transcribed collection of songs that had been accessible when the committee put the Hymnal Worship Book together. And 648, Kumbona Yesu, written by Stockwell Masamba from the U.S. Lingala Mennonite community. And this is an example. There are a few others as well that we were able to receive and include in Voices Together thanks to a grant from the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship that allowed 3 of our committee members to travel to other Mennonite communities across North America to hear their stories and learn songs of their communities, non-English communities. And the collection is richer to have this broader representation, and would have been things that, had we not have the grant, would have been much harder to hear from. And furthermore, what I think is also interesting is when conferences come together for regional assemblies or national assemblies, there are better ways that we have to be able to sing together that is more representative of the full constituencies. And there are a lot of great Anabaptist sending songs. We had to make some really, really difficult cuts because already the sending section was large. And we had enough to make a sending supplement, honestly. So 827, Move in Our Midst. 828, Wild Hope. 833, Save Us, O Lord. 841, As You Go Out From Here. 844, May the Face of God Shine on You by Harrisonburg, Jerry Holsapple, who works at EMU as well. And 849, We, Your People, Sing Your Praises. And that song actually was written by a Mennonite Central Committee worker and a Rwandan woman who were together wrote that for a peace conference in the Great Lakes region of Africa. And that was, it originated in English and French and was sung there in that context and brought to us through MCC Connections and is a wonderful, wonderful sending song, but it's also commissioning. It can be used in a lot of settings. And so we will learn that together as our final song together. So 849, and it happens to be the last song of the hymnal before the rest of the worship resources. 849. And we will sing it through a couple times in English. We are people, sing your praises, as together we are sent to reveal your new creation in the shadows of lament. Give us courage for the journey, Shepherd Jesus, be our guide. Help us lead with hope and passion, till all things are reconciled. We are people, sing your praises, as together we are sent to reveal your new creation in the shadows of lament. Give us courage for the journey, Shepherd Jesus, be our guide. Help us lead with hope and passion, till all things are reconciled. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for a fascinating journey through this new hymnal. And I want to say I'm glad that you've included several of Sean Kirshner's pieces. Sean was in my youth group at the Southwater Church of the Brethren. He is a triplet. And he composed a hymn on the way from his home in Cedar Falls to South Waterloo that he could play one tune on his left hand and one tune on his right hand together, and he still does that sort of thing. A gifted person. I'm hoping we can bring him here next year for the Sing Me High Music Festival. This would be a treat to have him, and knowing that he has some hymns in this new hymnal. Thank you all for coming. We want to let you know that these lectures will be posted on the Bridgewater Church of the Brethren Facebook, and we will have a link on the Brethren Mennonite Heritage Center website a link to this Facebook so that you may see this again. If you have not yet made a contribution in support of the Heritage Center and these lectures, the offering plates are back there. We invite you to return the books to the cart in the narthex. Are they for sale?
They could be.
They could be. For how much?
$25.
$25. They are for sale for $25. So there is that possibility. I'm sure that Ben will pocket that, and you'll enjoy several things. There are pieces in here that I think my daughter would appreciate as well. Go now with a blessing of music, where your heart sings what words cannot, and God, the giver of music, hears it all and blesses us. Go in peace.